She gave up her crucifix to buy a silent man. In a cage, they called him the $10 beast. But what she set free that day wasn't just him. It was something buried deep inside her own faith. So if you're still here, hit that subscribe button and comment one below when you're ready to listen, not just with your ears, but with your spirit. Because what you're about to hear isn't loud. It isn't flashy. It's quiet, holy. And it begins on a dirt road outside Fallow Ridge, where a nun stepped off her wagon with cracked boots and tired hands, and found herself staring at a cage no one cared to unlock until she did. Sister Magdalena was only passing through bound east toward an abandoned mission out past the canyon rim, a place the church had nearly forgotten, but not her. She rode alone in a creaking wagon drawn by a gray mule, her hands blistered from the reins and her shoulders sore beneath the weight of a life chosen long ago. In her satchel were only the bare essentials, a missal, a tin of salve, and the rosary she'd carried since she was 16. The wheel cracked just outside the saloon. No one offered help. Men on the porch chuckled over their cards. A barkeep leaned in the doorway like sin made of smoke. But what stopped her wasn't the broken wheel. It was the cage. It sat in the middle of the square like something dragged from a darker time. Rusted iron, splintered straw, and a man inside who didn't lift his head. He was barefoot. His shirt hung in rags, wrists bound in leather. A crude sign nailed to the side read, $10 to touch the beast. A boy threw a rock. It struck the bars and fell to the dirt. The man didn't flinch. He didn't even breathe. It seemed just sat still and silent, like a statue someone had given up on. Sister Magdalena stepped down from the wagon slowly. She walked toward the cage, not because she had a plan, but because her feet moved before her doubts could catch them. Around her, voices jeered, boots shuffled. A sheriff with a toothpick and too much time leaned against the post rail, whittling nothing into less. "What's he done?" she asked, voice steady. The sheriff shrugged. "Came down out of the hills carrying another man's saddlebag and a few too many holes in his side. Wouldn't say where he was headed. Wouldn't say much of anything." "Is he dangerous? To who?" the sheriff smirked. "You." The man lifted his head, then only part way, and Sister Magdalena saw his eyes. Not wild, not pleading, just watching. Quiet, tired, human. She took one step closer. "Does he have a name?" "He won't give it. He doesn't need to." She reached into her habit fingers, brushing across the small silver crucifix tucked near her heart. It had once belonged to her mentor, Sister Elena, the woman who'd taught her how to read scripture in the dark. She pulled it free and stepped forward, holding it out toward the sheriff like an offering. "Will this buy what he is?" There was no sound from the crowd now, only dust and waiting. The sheriff squinted, chuckled. "A nun trading a cross for a cage, Lord, have mercy." She didn't blink. "Mercy," she said, "is exactly what I came with." And somehow, standing there, in her black habit and worn boots, Sister Magdalena realized something she hadn't dared name. Until now, she wasn't breaking her vow. She was keeping it. If this story is stirring something in you, if you've ever believed that grace can come in quiet ways, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below with just one word, mercy. Because sometimes all it takes is one small act to change the direction of a soul. And what happens next might just change the way you see silence forever. They left Fallow Ridge at sundown. The sheriff had taken her crucifix with a scoff and a mutter, unlocking the cage with a rusty key like it was just another chore. The man didn't rise at first. But when Sister Magdalena turned to go, reins in her hand and dust rising behind her boots, he stood, wordlessly, without command. He climbed into the back of the wagon and sat cross-legged, eyes lowered, hands resting on his knees, like he wasn't sure whether he was still imprisoned. She didn't ask his name again. She only drove. The trail east was dry and narrow, cutting through a land that remembered war better than peace. By the second night, they'd spoken no words, not even grace before the evening meal. He gathered wood without being told, cooked quietly, kept watch after she'd lain down, his back to the fire and eyes on the dark. He moved with the care of someone who'd once made too much noise. And Sister Magdalena, who had taken a vow of obedience and prayer, began to feel a strange discomfort take root inside her. Not fear, not of him, but a question. one she didn't yet know how to form. On the third night, as they camped by a narrow stream, she sat across from him and finally spoke. "You never pray," she said, not accusing, just observing. He looked up surprised, then slowly shook his head. "You don't believe?" He reached for a stick and began to draw in the dirt. A circle, a smaller one inside it. Then a line through both. "No heaven?" she asked quietly. He looked at her not in defiance, but with a sadness so deep it didn't need words. She nodded slowly. "Then perhaps I meant to believe enough for both of us." He didn't respond. But that night before she lay down, she found her braid had been retied, carefully, neatly, and at its end was a small knot of twine, the same kind he used to tie their packs. She didn't know when he had done it, and that somehow made it feel sacred. The days passed like this, him working without being asked, her praying more than ever, but not with certainty, with longing, because every time she whispered the Psalms under her breath, she found herself wondering whether mercy could reach a man who no longer believed, and whether the mercy she had shown had been hers or God's. By the sixth night, she found him carving something by firelight. It was her form seated with head bowed, hands folded in her lap. When she asked why, he didn't answer, just handed it to her. It wasn't beautiful, but it was seen, true. She turned it over in her palms, heart suddenly aching in a way no hymn had stirred in years. And for the first time since she'd taken her vows, Sister Magdalena asked, not what would God want me to do, but simply, what if he's already done it, if you're still watching? And you've ever wrestled with questions you couldn't say out loud, go ahead and tap that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below with the word "still." Because sometimes the holiest moments don't come with answers. They come with presence. And in the silence that followed their journey, something deeper was beginning to speak. The days blurred softly into one another. By the second week, Sister Magdalena no longer reached for her crucifix when she rose, not because she had forsaken it, but because she was beginning to find something holy in the rhythm of their silence. He still hadn't spoken, but he listened, and she began to wonder if that was rarer. Each morning the campfire was already lit before she opened her eyes. Each evening her braid had been retied tighter, steadier, and always with some small token woven in a carved bead. A knot of cloth, a smooth pebble worn from river current. Not gifts, not adornments, marks of care, of presence. She never felt him do it, but she always knew it was him. One night they camped beside a cedar grove where the wind whispered like prayer through the branches. She sat near the fire, her hands wrapped around a tin of steeped herbs. He sat across from her carving again. He glanced up only once, long enough to meet her eyes, then back to the wood. She looked away quickly, not out of shame, but confusion, because something in that gaze felt too steady, too knowing, and it awakened in her a hunger not of flesh, but of belonging. The kind she had locked away the day she took her vows, the kind she thought only Christ was meant to hold. But here he was, flesh and scar, mortal and silent, and still somehow reverent. She rose and walked to the stream, needing air, needing space from the firelight. She leaned over the water, cupping it in her hands, letting it run over her skin like absolution. Then she caught sight of her reflection, her braid falling long and careful over her shoulder. At its end, tied just beneath the last knot of twine, was a single white bead carved in the shape of a flame. She hadn't placed it there. He had. She reached for it with trembling fingers, and something cracked open under her ribs, not sin, not desire, but the ache of being seen without being taken. She didn't speak when she returned, but she sat beside him, close enough to share warmth, not quite enough to touch. He didn't turn. He only handed her what he had been carving. It was a small wooden figure of her hand, open, empty, waiting. She looked at it for a long time, then folded her real hand around it. "I took a vow," she said softly, almost to the trees. "One I've never broken." He looked at her then, not with want, but with respect so deep it hurt. She nodded slowly, her voice steady but low. "But I think what we found here, it doesn't break anything." She paused, then whispered, "It just belongs somewhere no one can see but God." If this part of their story is reaching you not through noise, but through something quiet and honest, go ahead and like this video, subscribe if you haven't yet, and type the word name in the comments. Because sometimes to be truly seen is to be called by something deeper than what the world gives you. And what comes next? It's not just about a name. It's about becoming someone you never thought you could be. They didn't speak of that night by the fire. There were no confessions, no apologies, no lines drawn, and no lines crossed. But something had changed, not in body, but in spirit. A current now ran between them, quiet, constant, undeniable. Like a vow that hadn't been spoken aloud, yet lived in every small thing they did. The following morning, as Sister Magdalena prepared the mule and folded their blankets, he knelt near the edge of the trail, carving something into a flat piece of bark. His knife moved slowly with care, the kind of care people once gave to sacred things. She didn't interrupt. She had learned by now that his silence was never absence, only reverence. When he finished, he rose and placed the bark gently in her hands. One word had been carved into the grain: grace. She traced the letters with her fingers, the old calluses from years of prayer brushing across each curve. "Is that for me?" she asked quietly. He nodded. Her throat tightened. Grace. It wasn't just a name, it was a declaration. That whatever she had done on that square in Fallow Ridge when she gave up her crucifix and broke open her silence, it hadn't been sin. It had been salvation. For him. And maybe now she dared hope. For herself. She didn't deserve the name. But perhaps that was the point. Grace was never earned. It was given. Chosen. Later that evening, while he prepared a small stew over the fire, she found a spare length of her habit's torn sash, and with careful hands, she embroidered the word Solon into it, not in grand script, but in small, strong stitches. Then, as he sat by the fire, she approached without a word, tied it gently around his wrist, and let her hands linger just a moment longer than necessary. He looked down at it, then up at her. His eyes said everything. "Thank you. I accept. I'm not lost anymore." She smiled, not wide, not proud, just real. "I don't need you to speak," she said softly, "but I need you to stay." He nodded once. That night, as the fire burned low, and coyotes cried somewhere in the distance, she sat with her knees drawn to her chest, watching the stars blink open one by one. The bark carving lay across her lap, and around her wrist was the same rosary she'd once surrendered, returned to her earlier that day by a traveling priest who had passed them on the trail and then recognized her by name. She had thought she'd lost her faith when she gave it up for a stranger. But now she realized she'd only made room for a new one. Carved not in wood or stone, but in a silence that had become holy. And in that silence, she whispered what she hadn't dared. Before, thank you for finding me through him. As their journey nears its end, I want to ask you something simple. What part of this story stayed with you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because stories like this aren't meant to be watched alone. They're meant to be shared, felt, and remembered. So before we walk with them to the final bend in the trail, tell me, what did this story stir in you? I'll be reading every word. They reached the canyon by mid-morning, where the sky opened wide enough to feel like heaven hadn't left yet. Below them, free, the land stretched in golden waves. And just beyond the bend, hidden in a hollow of trees and rock, lay the broken walls of what once had been a mission, a place Sister Magdalena was meant to restore. She hadn't known if she would ever arrive. Now she wasn't sure she could have made it here alone. Solon stood beside her eyes, scanning the ruins with a calm that felt like promise. His wrist still bore the sash she had embroidered, faded now with dust and ash, but still strong. "This was supposed to be where I came to serve," she said softly. "But I think maybe it's where I came to be served too." He said nothing. He didn't need to. They cleared the space together that afternoon. She swept what was left of the old altar. He repaired a collapsed beam with salvaged wood and skillful hands. A simple fire burned in the center of the old sanctuary that night, not for worship, not for ritual, but for warmth. She sat beside it in her worn habit now threadbare from the journey. Her braid rested over her shoulder, tied with a bead he had slipped into place just the night before, a polished river stone shaped like a leaf. New life. He handed her a carving as the firelight danced this time. Not of her, not of him, but of two figures seated together beneath a cross made of two branches, lashed gently, reverently, not nailed. She ran her fingers over it, her voice a whisper, "This isn't the life I imagined." Solon looked at her, then reached slowly toward the hem of her sleeve. He didn't pull, he didn't ask. He only touched the fabric with his fingers and then pressed his hand to his own chest. Not possession, but belonging. She turned to face him fully. "I can't undo the vows I took," she said, "and I don't want to." He nodded. "But if God made room for you in my journey, then I believe He's made room for this too." That night, she braided her hair herself for the first time in weeks. At the end, she tied it off with our 3 beads, the flame, the word grace, and the leaf. No ring, no collar, just tokens of where she'd walked, what she'd chosen, and who had walked beside her. She slept in the old chapel, not alone. Not with a lover in the worldly sense, but with someone who had become the other half of her silence, her witness, her daily prayer. In the morning, the mule brayed softly outside. Light filtered through the slats like stained glass. And as Sister Magdalena rose, she whispered the only vow that still mattered, "Now I choose to stay." This story reminds us that the holiest acts are often the quietest, that love mercy. And healing rarely arrives with fanfare, but in the form of someone who chooses to stay. Sister Magdalena did not abandon her vows. She fulfilled them in the most human way possible by seeing dignity where others saw disgrace. Through her compassion, we learn that God's grace is not confined to church walls or rituals, but is alive in every act of kindness, every moment of presence, every braid tied with care. Solon never spoke a word. Yet his silence echoed a truth many of us forget, that redemption is not earned through noise, but through living each day as a prayer. The message is simple, but sacred. God often speaks not through thunder, but through the hands of those who choose love, when judgment is easier. And sometimes that's all the gospel needs. If this story spoke to something quiet in you, don't stop here. There's another story waiting, one that just might echo the ache, the faith, or the healing you didn't know you needed. Click on the next video and let the journey continue.